Hello and welcome to an introduction to Hegel's logic. I hope to reveal at the end of this presentation what Hegel meant with the absolute idea, to give you a mere introduction of his philosophy. So let's go. Hegel is the creator of a system of philosophical sciences. This is how he called it himself. He wrote the Phenomenology of Spirit, of course, which ends with absolute knowing. And I won't talk about the phenomenology of spirit today and the theory that you can find there, but I will assume that you have already a familiarity with it and will also be familiar with the idea that the phenomenology of spirit is written to get ordinary consciousness up to the level or the shape of spirit of absolute knowing, which is actually the starting point and the ground of the science of spirit, from which you can start doing proper philosophizing. Now, I will be talking about the lectures on logic. All the quotes that I will be quoting are from those. And the lectures on logic are a transcript by Hegel's back then 18-year-old son. And he has discussed those transcripts with his father, so they're probably pretty legitimate. And they can serve as a very good introductory tool to the Encyclopedia, and the first book in the Encyclopedia in particular, which is The Science of Logic. Now, Hegel's system of philosophical sciences is in the Encyclopedia is divided up in three parts: the science of logic, the science of nature, and the science of spirit. The science of logic in the Encyclopedia is like a smaller version of the science of logic, which is around 800 pages, and which is triadically divided up into three parts: being, essence, and idea. Like a lot of Hegelian philosophy is divided up in three parts. So basically, I want to take you from the starting point, which is absolute knowing, to the absolute idea. And of course, this is a minor introductory lecture. In the Science of Logic, Hegel says, all else is error, confusion, opinion, endeavor, caprice, and transitoriness. The absolute idea alone is being, imperishable life, self-knowing truth, and is all truth. Now, this is a very, very exciting quote, and you'll probably have no idea what he actually exactly means by this, which I hope to make clear at the end of this retroactively. So the science of logic, it's about thinking. First of all, what do we know about thinking? Thinking is ever-present and all-embracing. The moment you speak, you are thinking. The moment you're speaking about anything, the moment you're denoting any facts and whatever. So the goal here is to think thinking as thinking. That means that we have a notion of thought. We have a certain proposition of what thought is or might be. And then we have thought as an object, thought as how thought really is, the truth of thought, the objective truth of what thought is. And we want to go from the notion of thought, which we already have, to the object of thought, or thought as it is true in and for itself, which would bring us to the correspondence between notion and object as truth. Now, to do this, we have to put the senses and representations aside, since they are not thought. And instead of thinking objects, we're thinking itself as an object. So he starts by saying that the complete classification of logical forms is logic, and along with it, metaphysics. What is involved here is the strain of negation, of putting all sensation off to the side, and of keeping our own bright ideas to ourselves. In doing so, we must truly strain. Only at the very end of scientific education do we reach the point of observing these logical forms, for the sensory realm is more stimulating to us. I'll just take that apart. The complete classification of logical forms is logic, and along with it, metaphysics. So what does that mean? Well, Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, was the first to put forth the complete classification of these logical forms. But the problem, Hegel says, with Aristotle is that he didn't think thinking as thinking, but he theorized and speculated about them in the same way as he would do external sensory objects of thought. So think of things like, the objects of perception, whatever, books, animals, plants, things like this. Thinking itself, you can also take it as an object of thought, but it is a special kind of object of thought. And this is where Aristotle basically fails, according to Hegel. What is involved here is the strain of negation. So that means that we must put the senses off to the side. We don't lose the senses completely, but we don't want our thinking to be influenced to senses. And we do not want to think of bright ideas of what thought might be, but we actually want to get to the heart of the matter by dialectically explicating the process of our logic. And this hurts, Hegel says. In doing so, we must truly strain. This is not something easy. This is something that is very hard at first and becomes easier with practice, because this is not a normal way of thinking. And the sensory realm is more stimulating to us. That is another reason for why it is very hard to think in this manner that Hegel is putting forth. The senses and logic. The rose is red, but what is? If we take the simplest of sensory judgments, for example, the rose is red. What lies before consciousness is in appearance totally sensory. Yet the is in this judgment is already something of a different and non-sensory nature. There is nothing sensory about being. It is already something quite different. So you see a rose here on the screen, you perceive it, you sense it with your eyes. And when I say the rose is red, it seems like an immediate judgment on what you see. But actually there's more happening here. And the is in this judgment is already non-sensory, which means that we cannot pretend that saying that the rose is red is just an empirical sensory statement. There's something else happening here. Further, the rose and what is red, as we find them before us in sensation, are one, while it is I who introduced difference or division between them. What lies ready at hand is simple and undivided. It is I who differentiate and divide. I am the source of judging, urteilen, and the act of dividing, einteilen. This judgment belongs to me as the one who apprehends what is simple by introducing division. But what is more, if I say red, the predicate expresses a universal characteristic that at once belongs to blood and various other objects. Yet what I have before me is only a singular red, this determinately red thing. Yet this same red also assumes the character of universality, which at once belongs to me, insofar as I've abstracted it from what is singularly red. So there's something else that's happening in the statement, the rose is red. What is this exactly? Well, first of all, as you perceive the red rose, it is just one thing. But when I say the rose is red, it seems like I'm talking about two different things and colliding them together, which is what is called judgment. First, I divide them into something that's a rose and something that is red, the rose being the subject, the red being the predicate. And then I say the subject is the predicate, or the rose is red, which is first it's division, then it's judgment. And this judgment belongs to me. It's not something that the rose is doing. It's not even something that my sensation or perception is doing. It is something that I'm doing by logic. And this red that the rose is belongs to many other objects. So not only the rose is red, but also the blood can be red, the book can be red, which means that this is a universal concept that you can apply to many subjects, in fact. And by just taking this simple sentence, the rose is red, by thinking what we're doing when we're thinking of a sentence like this is called positing the presuppositions. And by positing the presuppositions of our thought and what we are doing, we can see that there's much more happening that is that we first might think that there is happening. Another example, the house is toppled by water. What I see by my senses is the water, and afterwards the toppling of the house. Yet the determination of the one as cause and the other as effect is not a sensory determination, but is a determination belonging to me. Only the successive happenings in time are sensory. Careful inspection shows that, along with sensory objects and interwoven with them, logical forms arise that are quite alien to them. that are not sensory objects. So the distinction emerging here is the succession of phenomena as something sensory, a sensory determination, and cause and effect as logical concepts which you do not directly sense with your eyes or whatever. These are not empirical, which is also why Hume critiqued ideas such as these. Now, what are these concepts exactly? What is cause and what is effect? Well, one faculty of the mind which aims at understanding a phenomena is called the understanding by Hegel. And he says here, nothing can be in contradiction with itself. That is a fundamental law of thought. If we apply this law immediately in the realm of singularity, this plant is this plant, this animal is this animal, it is a completely one-sided determination. Formally, identity is abstract, yet difference must also exist within identity. One says that all finite things pass away, that their very essence is to cease to be. Self-negation is their nature. We say what is finite is, but this law already contains a contradiction insofar as we apply being to what is finite. Finite things consist precisely in being contradictory. Nothing contradicts itself is thus a poor excuse for a law of logic. Again, the fundamental distinction that Hegel is making here is that abstract identity and the law of non-contradiction, or A equals A, is a fundamental law of thought. You cannot work in the world without having this law of thought, but it is a poor excuse for a law of logic. Now, what exactly does he mean with abstract identity and law of non-contradiction? Well, this is a law put forth by Aristotle, and abstract identity is an equation or a tautology where something is what it is. But the problem with this for Hegel is that if we take something finite, for example, an apple, through time, through its process of logical moments that we can determine with our thought, it will cease to be, which means that it is negated, which means that the apple will no longer be the apple, that the negation of the apple is in the very nature of it being an apple. An apple is something that you eat. Therefore, when you eat the apple, it is no longer an apple. The apple and you are one when it is in your stomach and being digested. This is the nature of the apple as a finite entity. Now, this is just an example, but this goes so far with every finite entity, finite object. Which means that there is something happening here that we cannot reduce to the equation of A equals A, because this is merely abstract, and the concrete apple is being negated through time. Now, in the phenomenology of spirit, Hegel claims that the power of spirit is to withstand contradiction and withstand negativity, whereas nature itself succumbs to negativity and cannot grasp and think it. We can actually think in contradiction, and we can take hold of it. Now, this is an example of a propositional syllogism. 1, all men are mortal. 2, Cassius is a man. 3, therefore Cassius is mortal. Well, what's happening here? First of all presupposes that I know all men, which I do not. So why am I? How can I say all men? Well, I have a universal notion of man, which has arisen from my empirical awareness, to be sure. But the fact that this is a universal concept means that actually I'm not really changing the universality of the concept, or I'm not thinking this logical concept as it is for itself. I'm just putting forth a tautology. That means that I must have already known that Cassius is mortal when I say that all men are mortal. So I'm not saying anything here. It's a circular conclusion. And this form of logic that the understanding does, where you have mere propositional tautologies, do not get us anywhere insofar that we want to do science of logic. And Hegel actually asks us to do violence to the familiarity of the understanding, which means that in our thought, we must deal with the loss, with negativity, and with self-alienation in doing philosophical science and being speculative philosophers. So he says here, to be a speculative logician is to apprehend opposite determinations within their unity. This is what the understanding has such a tough time with, since it is always holding the determinations outside one another. So the understanding has a very tough time with dealing with opposite determinations because they're seen as isolated and external to each other, whereas actually there is a logical inseparability of both, which makes the meaning of both possible. The understanding posits essential referential relations, referring to terms such as cause and effect, but has no insight into the necessity of the relation. Religion is full of representations, but again, it lacks the insight by a self-same subject into the necessary relation of the determinations as one after another they come to be recounted. Any insight in such necessity is lost on representation as such. Thinking is simply something else than representing. To thinking as such belongs whatever is universal. So we have already seen this, right? Sense is something external, it's something that you directly sense. Representation, or the German term is Vorstellung, is when I say the rose is red and you have an internal image. And thinking and conceptuality and the universality of this is something else. And universal concepts themselves enable us to think in language. And three crucial terms that Hegel uses are universality, particularity, and singularity. I will explain this with another triad that's very popular with Hegel. That's abstraction, negation, and concretion. So if I have an abstract universal, it must be negated to be concrete for Hegel. Or in other words, a universal can only be realized through particularity as something singular. Now, if I have a copy of the Phenomenology of Spirit here in my hands, this is a singular copy. And how do we distinguish between different copies of the Phenomenology of Spirit? Is that they are different singular copies. But there is a particularity to the Phenomenology of Spirit as such. And what happens with representation is that you extract something out of a sense. So if I'm talking about a battle I perceived, I represent it to you with images, with my picture thought, then that is a simpler extraction than what actually took place. Now, the understanding does make use of those referential relations like cause and effect, but it cannot understand the necessary relation between the two. So what does that mean? Well, what is a cause? A cause is always preceded by an effect. Well, what's an effect? An effect is always preceded by a cause. So to explain the one, I have to take in the other, and to explain the other, I have to take in the one. So where do we get here? Well, there's a certain inseparability between these concepts, obviously. And this is what a lot of philosophies can actually understand and call dialectical. But what Hegel is doing here is taking another step. We would ask the question, what is a cause? What is the cause of the cause? Or in other words, what is the cause for itself? And just like we saw with the example with the rose is red, the rose, the red, and there's a third element here, which activates both the division and the judgment upon the rose and the red. And this is the subject. So the subject as such is the cause of the cause. Abstraction and truth. What I determine what is singular, this or that, by universal determinations which can be shared with other things. What is singular and what is universal are thus quite inseparable. And here lies the nature of whatever is concrete. There is nothing true in what is singular as such, just as there is nothing true in the universal as such, since both are only empty abstractions. As we think and philosophize, abstractions no doubt arise, but it is precisely the job of the science of speculative logic to come to know the true nature of abstractions, to come to know that whatever is abstract is thereby empty of truth. So abstraction is empty of truth. The abstract self-identity of A equals A is empty of truth. Of course, when I'm saying something like the rose is red, I'm not saying A equals A. I'm bringing in something else that is universal redness, applying it on the rose and saying it is a fundamental property of the rose in my apprehension of it. Now, the words singular and universal are both abstractions, and the universal is only made singular by the particular, which means that they only contain truth when they are inseparable with each other. The I, for example, when I say the word I mean this, I mean that. I at once say this singular I that I am, and the I, the universal concept as such, which you will all have an understanding of. So the three historical positions of thought that Hegel talks about in the Lectures on Logic and the Encyclopedic Logic are the ancient one, which relied on the understanding, which basically equated self-identity and didn't have a dialectical self-reflection, which means they didn't have an understanding of the subject as the thinking agent, which does the division and the judgment upon the objects of thought. And the ancients naively presupposed that if I want to get to the essence of an object of thought, I merely have to think it through. Then I will get to the essence and I will know the truth of it, which means I can move on to the next thing. Well, first of all, they didn't see this inseparability of concepts like cause and effect, for example, but also there's something more going on. And this is what the modern position of thought toward objectivity basically brought out. Immanuel Kant said that we have a certain categories of our mental faculty that inhibit us to understand the thing in itself. So that means our mind is a kind of filter. Reality as it is out there is unknowable to me because I have those filters, which means that I will never know the truth of being in itself or what reality really is. Thinking, in other words, is separated from this. And he said that insofar as we were talking about phenomena within the mind, we can speak of truth. But outside of it, as the truth really is, or the noumenal truth, the noumenon, this is beyond our cognition. Hegel was, of course, massively influenced by Kant, and he thought this was not really enough. Now, I won't go into the details of what this means because this is a huge topic. But basically, if there's one sentence in which you could say the entirety of Hegel's philosophy, it's that the absolute is substance as well as subject. That means that every so-called eternal, abiding, self-consistent, self-identical object is also vanishing, is also transitory, is also passing, which is subject. Now, Hegel, of course, in the phenomenology of spirit, he brings you to absolute knowing. In the science of logic, he brings you to the absolute idea. So these are two fundamental terms in his philosophy. And something you can do with being a speculative or Hegelian philosopher is write a book like Enter the Alien, which some of the co-writers of Enter the Alien are here in our room right now. And you can speculate on the science of spirit as a method for tantric spiritual practice. So this triad of ancient, modern, and speculative is a triad that Hegel himself talks about. This is how he divides the history of philosophy. Of course, this is massively summarized. What about thoughts in regards to objectivity and subjectivity? Now, thoughts are objective insofar as a subject has all whole of it like an object. This is something we usually do not think about. Metaphysics is therefore a thinking of objects. We may indeed call it applied logic, though it is very different from the applied logic of the usual textbooks. The distinction between thinking and its objects falls by the wayside, for we now have objective thoughts, that is, thoughts which themselves are the matter at hand. One thinks the matter, one does not think about it, but we are rather lodged within it, in the matter itself. Objective thoughts are thoughts which constitute the content itself. They are what is substantial. Logic is thus content, and with that it coincides with metaphysics. So again, Hegel is saying that logic itself directly is metaphysics. At the end, I will go into this with more depth. But the crucial thing that he's saying here is that we usually think of that we have thinking on the one side and objects on the other side. But the moment we ask the question, what is thinking? We're taking thinking itself as an object of thought. And therefore, that thought is objective. So what about thought and being? Well, in the absolute idea, thought is being. He says, we shall come to know higher truth more closely in the idea, where the self-concept is at once reality. What is true is the idea. In the idea, there are two determinations, thought and reality. Thought and the object or being. Abstractly viewed, we have an opposition of thinking and being, and the idea is the unity of the two. There are thus two sides, and the only question is the relation between the two. It is a question of their unity, of the kind of unity that's found here. That is the great question of philosophy, which has principally occupied the interest of our age. If thought determinations are finite, they are untrue. Truth generally is whatever is infinite. Truth is found wherever reality corresponds to the self-concept. Thus, the self-concept has hold in reality of nothing beyond what is its very own. That the two are other to each other is mere show. The self-concept intuits itself in reality. It is for itself in what is real. It is other than itself, but is at once one and the same as itself in the other. So what's the self-concept, first of all? In German, it's Begriff, which you could just translate to concept as well, or notion. Now, the idea is something else. The idea is the unity of thought and being. It's the unity of the self-concept and being, thought and reality. Now, for Hegel, the question is not whether the self-concept will ever come to know reality, or how it is impossible for the self-concept to know reality, which are more Kantian questions. But the question of philosophy is the kind of unity that we find with thought and being. Thought and being are inseparable, and whatever you think about being will have whatever being is for your thought, and whatever you think that your thought is for being are inseparable. You can't see them as isolated and apart from each other. Now again, he says, if thought determinations are finite, they are untrue. Truth is whatever is infinite. And where is truth found? Well, wherever reality corresponds to the self-concept, which is actually in the negativity of the subject. Thus, the self-concept has a hold in reality of nothing beyond what it is its very own. That means that the moment you posit a certain limit, and the beyond of that limit, you have already surpassed that limit. This is basically how Kant is actually, you could say, cheating. He's positing the thing in itself, but by positing the thing in itself, you must have a certain view that is itself beyond the thing in itself. And this self-concept intuits itself into reality. It is for itself in what is real. It is other than itself, which means that if I say a thing in itself, it means that it's other to my phenomenal categories. But by doing this, I've already instantiated it as a concept. And therefore, it is same as itself in the other. Again, self-concept and reality are united in the idea. Philosophy for Hegel is about the relation between thought and being in their unity. The self-concept which moves beyond the faculty of the understanding to reason is at one with itself in its other. And the externality of both, the fact that both are seen as abstractly divided from each other and mutually independent, is mere show. It's an appearance, but it is not actually so. And of course, nothing beyond its own, as it is its own self-posited otherness. So all the otherness that is posited by thought will be taken up again by thought itself, which is a movement, a logical movement that dialectically takes place. Now, Zizek talks about this in his Ticklish Subject. It's a great book on logic and metaphysics. There is no absolute beyond or above the reflexive oppositions and contradictions of the finite. The absolute is nothing but the movement of self-sublation of these finite determinations. It is not beyond reflection, but is absolute reflection itself. Once Hegel gained this insight, the distinction between logic and metaphysics had to collapse. Logic itself had to be identified with metaphysics, with the philosophical science of the inherent categorical network that determines every conceivable form of reality. So what's the absolute? Well, the absolute contains all. And a naive way of conceptualizing the absolute would be that I'm going to study philosophy, and once I read all of Hegel or all of Kant or all of Aristotle, I will come to know the absolute at the end of the journey. Now, for Hegel, it's the opposite. At the beginning of this presentation, when I mentioned Hegel's quote about absolute being, you already knew what the absolute was. And like I said, what we are doing with doing science of logic is we're positing presuppositions. And presuppositions are, of course, things that you must already know to be able to posit. Which means that explicating logic is the same as explicating metaphysics, since by going deeper into the logic, you're only going deeper into metaphysics, or what Hegel says, or what Zizek says. It's a great Freudian slip. With the philosophical science of the inherent categorical network that determines every conceivable form of reality. Now, Hegel talked about truth generally is whatever is infinite. Truth is found wherever reality corresponds to the self-concept. And Hegel is kind of just like with absolute knowing and absolute idea coming at the end, and you could imagine this to be a big revelation, which is also the source of many misreadings of Hegel and why he has been accused of being a totalitarian and all subsuming. Well, logic itself had to be identified with metaphysics, and the absolute is already intrinsic to this process. There is nothing outside of this. So finitude is all we have, and truth as infinite is the fact that finite determinations will come to an end in their untruth. If thought determinations are finite, they are untrue. Truth is found whenever reality corresponds to the self-concept, and the correspondence between reality and the self-concept happens in equations like thought is being. Because at the very intersection of thought and being, you paradoxically lose both thought and being in the mutual negation, which is the subject. And this negativity is the basis of what many people call onto-epistemology, the collapsing of ontology and epistemology. So we're becoming aware of something that we already know. What we have here is the paradigmatic case of dialectical progress, so-called. We pass from logic, dealing with external reflexive oppositions, with reasoning as opposed to its object, being, to metaphysics, directly describing the structure of the absolute, not by any kind of progress of a major transmutation of logic, but by becoming aware of what we misperceived or perceived as a mere organon, introductory tool, preparatory step to our grasping the absolute, that is, to metaphysics proper, already describes the structure of the absolute. In other words, we fail to grasp the absolute precisely insofar as we continue to presuppose that above and beyond the domain of our finite reflected reasoning, there is an absolute to be grasped. We actually overcome the limitation of external reflection by simply becoming aware of how this external reflection is inherent to the absolute itself. This is Hegel's fundamental criticism of Kant. Not that Kant fails to overcome the external reflection of the understanding, but that he still thinks that there is some beyond which eludes our grasp. What Kant does not see is that his critique of pure reason as the critical prolegomenon to a future metaphysics already is the only possible metaphysics. Now, with that being said, I think we can go into the discussion. I'll stop sharing my screen right here. I'll open it up to everyone. Is there any questions?
I have a question.
Sorry.
So my question has to do basically with religion and how subject and object relate to religion through time. There seems to be a connection here to Zoroastrianism in the sort of the idea that good thoughts grounds you into having a good life. How do you understand? I guess my question is, how do you understand religion through this through dialectics?
So Hegel has an entire philosophy of religion. Hegel was a Lutheran himself. Some basic presupposition that he takes before writing the Science of Logic and the Encyclopedia is that God is. In other words, God exists. And then he tries further to explicate all these other metaphysical or logical categories. The problem with religion as this kind of, let's say, as a societal phenomenon that connects people by rituals and narratives. Take, for example, the triad of God, Holy Spirit, and Christ. Hegel said that within religion itself, they cannot understand how this triad actually works, because these triads are represented by pictures, by images. So he would say that, to dialectically explicate religion, you have to be an absolute knower. You have to be beyond religion in this sense. You have to be a philosopher. And then you can come to know the truth of the religion. Now, as far as it goes for Zoroastrianism, he does actually talk about it in the Phenomenology of Spirit. But if you talk about it with Alexander Barth, he does totally not agree that that is Zoroastrianism. For Hegel, Zoroastrianism is this kind of religion of immediate light. I think that's from what I remember. But he doesn't really have interesting thoughts on the historical Zoroastrianism. Now, what about a 21st century view on religion from a Hegelian perspective? Well, I think Enter the Alien is super interesting to read here because, of course, Alexander Barth is a Zoroastrian. He writes a paper. Hegel has a whole paper about atheism. and Hegel. But I think in general, there's a clear separation between religion and philosophy. You know, like religion can't understand philosophy, but philosophy can understand religion. That's what I'd say. But also I'd say that, you know, Hegel has a triad of the absolute spirit. This triad is a triad of religion, art, and philosophy. So why is philosophy special? Because philosophy can actually cognize or comprehend what the other two are doing with thought, whereas religion can merely represent it, and art can. I mean, Hegel has a whole philosophy of art. I don't want to simplify it here, but philosophy is doing something special here for sure.
Thank you.
Can you expand a bit more on what is self-concept?
Okay, so self-concept sounds maybe a bit confusing because what's the self exactly? Well, like I said, it's Begriff in German, and you can also translate it to notion. It's a popular way to translate it. I would say a good starting point with understanding the self-concept is if you take the self, the world, and the self-concept is basically that which encompasses both. So you have a certain idea about yourself being in the world, you have a certain idea about the world. The unity of that all is the notion or the self-concept. And this self-concept is not something passive that never changes and is just static. But let's say you have a trauma happening in life, some very deep negativity, then you will change your self-concept according to that. So, you know, this is how the self-concept changes with every shape of consciousness or shape of spirit. Hegel starts with consciousness, then you have self-consciousness, reason, spirit, religion. Those are the chapters.
Okay, and yeah, the idea makes sense. And so what I didn't understand was like where there was like something that by thinking about the world, like the separation between thinking and the world dissipates, something like that, if I got that correctly.
I mean, that's thought is being. That's basically a radical thing that Hegel is saying. And whereas the ancients were also saying that thought is being, and by thinking hard enough, basically you can get to the essence of an object. Basically, all philosophers right now would admit that after Immanuel Kant's break from the ancient conceptuality, from the ancient philosophy, we can't go back anymore. So this idea of our mind that filters reality, right? This is that a lot of scientists would agree with that. Yeah, we can never know truth as it really is. But Hegel is saying, no, we can actually correspond our notion to the object, or we can correspond the phenomenal to the noumenal. Because, yeah, Jason, please, if you have any thoughts, you can come in here, because this is like the question, it's a great question because it's the central question of Hegelian philosophy, actually. But
Yeah.
yeah.
In the
What do you think?
ESPN zone here. I think a good way to think about it is that where does the essence lie? The ancients would say that if you think very hard, you can get to the essence of the object. The essence is outside. So the essence is, let's say you have an apple, right? And then you don't know what it is. You think about it, you study it, and it's like, aha, I've got the essence of the apple. So but after Kant, and this is a long story, obviously, it's got reversed, that the essence is actually in the is constructed in the through the categories of thinking and so on. So that would be the reversal point that Kant brought forth. So in the ancient, and then well, So hold on. How would you say Hegel moves this forward? Because this is
I would,
your stream. I don't
yeah,
know.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I would
Yeah,
say that
I don't want to hog it.
thought and being intersect at their mutual negation. Now,
Yeah,
this is very hard to understand because in their mutual negation, you lose both thought and being. But I would say you can also say it like this, the ancients did naive ontology. Kant said, no, we cannot do ontology, we can only do epistemology.
epistemology.
And Hegel says, no, there is something missing here in the relationship between ontology and epistemology, that when you're doing epistemology, you're also already doing an ontology.
Yeah.
And when you're doing an ontology, of course, you're already doing an epistemology. So there is a unity of thought and being. And I mean, yeah, they intersect in their mutual negativity, but this is something
But
you have to get
I
to by thinking a lot. And I would say that, asking the question like, okay, there is a unity of thought and being, and what is this is already, I mean, Hegel said it is the greatest question of philosophy itself already.
I think the lesson is that it just moves closer and closer to us throughout the millennia, the essence of the object. I think what Hegel brought forward is this straining, this kind of effort that we need to do. That is already like being. That is what, when we negate the object, we determine it. So the being is in this negation, is in this judgment. When we put forward the judgment, that is already the bringing forward of essence.
Yeah, I think that's a great one. I think also, to bring in the notion of negation here, or sublation, when you go through the shapes of spirit in the phenomenology of spirit, once you go past a certain shape and you discover that it is untrue, you discover that it relies on a certain self-contradiction which it doesn't realize itself. The moment it does realize this, it has to go beyond this. And when you look back at this shape of spirit, which could also be in your own life with, I used to be an ideologue. I used to have these certain kinds of ideas, and now I know it's not true because it's proven so by experience. Well, then you can see that the way that it is untrue is not just it's untrue, but it has a certain form. And this is called determinate negation. So it's not just, it's not true, I don't know anything. It's untrue. And this untruth of this shape of spirit tells me something true about reality and about myself.
Yeah, this very problem
So
is
you don't
already,
ignore negativity, you don't put it to the side, but you take it, you face it, and you say, okay, there is something true happening here. It's not just external, it's not just contingent. There's something real here. Yeah.
So yeah, go ahead, sorry.
So this is basically explaining how thought contradicts being and like negates being, right? That, like, also from what you've said, I understood that being negates thought. Can you elaborate on that?
Now, what is negation? Negation, fundamentally, if A is negated, it means not A. Now, there's an active agent. Hegel is basically, I mean, I don't know how you think about this, Jason, but I think that with Nietzsche, we get some anti-Cartesian critique that's also applicable to Hegel, because for Hegel, the thinking subject or spirit is the agent of this doing. So Hegel actually calls the self a self-negating negation. You can kind of see it as a hollowing out of the substantiality of reality. Like when you were a child, you were full of imagination and potential, and when you see a lot of people who are older, they are dead on the inside and stuff like this. I mean, this is not like a necessary, you don't have to be dead when you get older, but they have moved through negation in a certain sense, and they have way less potentiality, right? So
What I will add
they
to that,
hollowed out the substantiality. I would say something like this.
yeah, the substantiality is very interesting. And we've talked about this before. I think what is being negated is not being, but what is being negated is what's called ready at hand thing that are basically immediacy. If you go earlier into your slide, I think you talk about this a little bit. Um, so when we say the rose is red, this determination we do, this is-ing that we do it basically to substance, maybe, right? Something like that. But it's not substance as if what I think Hegel's contribution is that it's not saying that substance is like out there in front of us, but it is immediacy as such. And when we negate this immediacy as such, which is to say we determine it, that I think that's where being is. Being is this very mediation of the immediate.
Right.
But
Yeah. And being
yeah,
is just is, right? Like
I think being is
being
the
is just another
action.
conjugation of
Yeah,
the verb is.
yeah.
It's not just like, oh, it's being whatever. It's just
It just is.
yeah,
Yeah,
it just is.
right,
But what is this is? And this is an equation of subject and predicate.
right,
Right.
right.
If we explicate that, we can discover there's a universality to this, there's a certain form to this.
But it is also, and maybe we can talk about this further. It's kind of like it is what it is, but also you need it. You can't get out of it. You cannot pull out and look at it as if to know. And this is why
Yeah.
Hegel moves forward from Kant, right? Kant acts as if we can see this is, but we
Yeah.
can never get out of this is. We're in it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
exactly.
yeah,
I would say that to add to this, Kant basically says, okay, when I use the faculty of reason, I will end up in antinomies. I will end up in contradictions. So that must be untrue. One response that Hegel could give is, but what is it about the nature of reality that we can be beings that can actually think contradictions productively? That means that they must be embedded in reality itself. Because if there is no contradiction in reality, then we couldn't think of it, right? And this is
yeah,
something that Kant couldn't see. He would just, not look at it. Okay, that's untruth. I don't continue forward on that path. Whereas Hegel and Freud, and psychoanalysis and even Nietzsche, they are aware of contradictions and they use this for their own thinking in a productive manner.
So my question would be, just I hope we're not moving on to an irrelevant topic too fast. But my question would be, could you explain again how we arrive to the absolute, the way you said it earlier? Could you explain again this circularity
So we
that you pause in the first and then we arrive again in the end?
so we the arrival to the absolute is a becoming aware that we were always already there.
We're already in it, yeah.
We think, okay, it's like in the introductory of the phenomenology of spirit, right? We have a problem with method because every method presupposes that truth is in a certain way. So that means that what do we do? Because we must have a method. Even asking these questions already is a kind of a method in a certain way. Well, the thing is that by being in this process and staying with it and not thinking of bright ideas to get out of it, to get out of the claustrophobia of this logical process, by doing that, we're already doing logic. And with that, we all are already describing the fundamental metaphysics of being. So this is why being and logic, or like metaphysics and logic
And metaphysics, yeah.
That's what I would say. Does that make sense?
It reminds me of oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, please go on.
It kind of reminds me of my a friend of mine once explained this in a similar way about how Buddhist monks they'll be sent away from the temple and made to just sit for days and sometimes weeks, just meditating on what being is, and they end up they end up basically just exhausting themselves over and over and over again by um, they come up with all these answers to what being is or what thought is, and then every time they go back to the highest monks, the highest priests, the elders, their whatever idea that they have is rejected, and they send them back out in this process of basically exhausting them to the point where they don't think about it anymore. Like they just are. And is that similar to how you think about like absolute spirit, absolute knowledge?
Well, I mean, I know this practice. This is something they do in Zen Buddhism. They ask you like some question like, how does it sound when you clap with one hand? And you say it doesn't sound like anything. And he says, no, wrong, go back. And then you come back and you say it sounds like nothingness. And then he says, no, wrong, go back. And then you sit with this all the time until you come to him.
Yeah.
And you have supposedly given your own authentic answer. And I think there's, Alexander Barth says Hegel is like Zen, and Nietzsche is like, what was it again? I don't remember, but Hegel is very Zen. Hegel just sits with it.
There is a
Hegel
meditative element to Hegel,
yeah,
I feel like
Hegel doesn't get like that's the crazy thing about Hegel is that he does say, the self concept intuits itself in reality. But he also doesn't want to get bright ideas about what that might be. So he doesn't jump around the place like Deleuze and wants to think of a lot of new concepts. Because for Hegel, he actually knows that these new concepts may be a way for you to escape the claustrophobia of logic. The fact that you are always here, you're with your own thoughts. Hegel's like, yeah, let's be confronted with the fact that those thoughts will also be alienating. But he says also that, with the very alienation of thinking that always becomes other than what it is already, you stay the self-same. So there's no reason to worry in this sense. Like that's why Hegel says, that spirit, spirit only knows its truth when it's being torn asunder.
What I will add to that is that I really like that story. I'm not super familiar with Buddhism, but the way I always think about this problem of being is precisely that. It's a problem. It starts off as a problem, and once you realize that reality presents itself as essentially a problem, I think you can begin thinking the absolute, like I also think of the absolute as like a necessity, right? And what is the necessity of absolute? Is that is a problem. It's always a problem. So yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Hegel wants us to kind of suffer in this problem, right? To strain ourselves, I think.
Yeah, Hegel, that's why he says, the power of spirit is to stay with negativity. And he equates also absolute negativity with blessedness, which is what spirit man doesn't understand. But here's a nice quote by Hegel. He says, the force of spirit is only as great as its expression, and its depth only goes as deep as it trusts itself to disperse itself and lose itself in the explication of itself. So I think Hegel is a perfect philosopher if you want to justify doing crazy things like Tantra, because by going into something like this and allowing yourself to express yourself in whatever way. You know, most people, they don't actually dare to do this because, oh, I'm not this kind of person. I'm not the person who does that. I'm this kind of person. But that's not your greatness. The greatness is you going out there and to dare to change yourself, to express yourself in manners that you have never expressed yourself. And this is how deep your personality and your psyche goes. If in how far you can trust yourself in this process of losing yourself. And of course this is how you learn also, I believe.
I have a perhaps a simple question. What do you have to say about the movement from, let's say, these tautological things about the law of non-contradiction, right? In the beginning we have like one circularity, which is the tautology of a thing must be that thing,
Yeah.
right? That's what the law. And then we have this other circularity, which is like the absolutely onto-epistemic circularity, where you cannot kind of detach being from the knowing of being. What do you have any comments regarding that, like
Yeah, so
the two circularities?
so the move from understanding to reason is a faculty that's done by, you know, a speculative philosophy, is loss. In the understanding, there's a presupposition that there is some beyond truth that we do not have access to. Whereas with reason, you just lose this beyond. Which means with reason, again, logic and metaphysics coincide, and it's not like we're just working on something right now that we will someday get at with the future. You know, in that sense, it's so interesting that, you know, we all have different kinds of comprehensions of Hegel and philosophy and life in general, but we are all already here with the absolute. We're all already in this process of the becoming of the absolute, and that is also super meditative, you know. You know, I can already imagine Hegel sitting in this Zen monk position with his hands like that, and like that's the thing. For he also says, you know, Kant said we have the phenomenon on the one side, the noumenon on the other side. We have, you know, reality on as it is through our filter on the one hand, and then reality as it really is out there. We can never know that. And Hegel, one of Hegel's reactions to this is, well, the fact that your phenomenon will come up and they will dissipate and they will come up and dissipate again, whether they are logical, sensory, or perceptible. This is the in itself, the very flux of this movement. The arising and passing.
So would you say that absolute knowing is kind of like getting rid of the cookie at the end, getting rid of
yes, that's
getting
it.
rid of the orgasm.
Yeah,
like
yeah,
the need
that's
to
it.
orgasm.
Yeah, that's it.
Like
that's it. It's that in an intellectual way, because we want to intellectually orgasm all the time. That's the fucking problem. You know, that's why you get all these scientists and all these, you know, 17, 18-year-olds who are like, oh yeah, I know how the world works. This idea has never been tried. And they come up with these stupid ideas that if you're just a bit well-read and a bit older, that you can see, okay, this isn't going anywhere. It's just a fucking ejaculation. Mm-hmm. But you have to stay with the contradiction, realize it's a process. You're not gonna get out of it. You're already there. And just like, this is also like, why did I do this presentation? For example, I didn't read the Encyclopedic Logic. I never even opened up the Science of Logic. But I read some of the lectures on logic, and I talked a lot about Hegel with people, and I read this book. And I just said, you know, fuck it, I will try anyway. So you have to, Hegel's a great thinker for like going through imposter syndrome, you know? Because you're always an imposter anyway, you know. Persona means mask in Greek. Gerard would say the same fucking thing, you know. You're not there's no authentic self behind anything. There's no real revelation orgasm coming. No, intellectually and maybe sexually, yes, but then always 5 minutes later you're like, oh fuck, why did I have to come, you know? I could have gone on or whatever.
Yeah, it's like seeking enlightenment. Like you never really actually it's the contradiction of the Enlightenment itself is realizing that there is no such thing as enlightenment, and that
Yeah.
it's just the process of going through that.
Yes. Yes. Because that's the thing with fantasy, right? Like, you cannot negate fantasy as such. You will always have fantasies of the perfect woman or of whatever. You will have this in the future, and then it will all be okay. And you have to go through that, and you have to live it out to know that it won't be like this. Because if you deny that and think, oh, it's never going to be that the thing in itself anyway, then you're just going to be paralyzed. And that's not what Hegel is for, right? But this is what you said, like removing the orgasm from the intellectual, from the practice of philosophy. This is why I called my paper Hegelian Tantra edging the absolute, because you're never ejaculating the absolute. You're always there already with the absolute and with the tension. Yeah.
I think we
It's
get
about
this
having
from.
courage.
Go ahead.
Was that?
Oh,
I was gonna like interject a little bit. We've been really doing a lot of meditation on Nietzsche lately, and I think we get this in Nietzsche. The the sort of calling to do to do the star dance, right? Like you have to have a bit of chaos in you to give birth to a dancing star. And I think it's sort of like it's being able to posit the sort of myth of these these patterns, this knowing, but then also like sort of facing up to the fact that they don't actually exist, that there are no patterns. I think this is sort of like this is something that I've been sort of like I keep coming up against, like trying to think about Hegel, trying to think about Nietzsche. That how do you affirm the this eternal recurrence? Like how do we all of the everything that's a part of your existence. I think you probably have to like believe in in the Hegelian sort of becoming of the absolute. But yeah, we're already in it. It's only like when we stop and think about this narrative that we generate, that's when we're we're sort of, that's when we're kind of creating some sort of myth about like about what's happening. So what is what is red, what the rose is red, it is red for me, and we can like agree all we like about it is red for you, but well, there's that gap, the gap of of actually knowing me, knowing you in yourself, or anyone else for that matter, or maybe even myself in itself. And we're going to fill that void with language. The only way we can sort of bridge that divide is like with more language. The rose is red. Then we use more language to try to fill the gap and try to keep covering it up. And there's always a little bit more gap. So we're being, you keep saying claustrophobic, and I'm like, yeah, we're kind of, we're a subject, there's like this void inside, and but we're always we're always already in this absolute becoming. And so I mean, I think that's so I liked your presentation today, Dimitri, and I think it was it really does sort of like encapsulate this lessons on logic very nicely. It's a good way to get like excited for the science of logic too. But Nietzsche's in here somewhere, you know what I mean? Really, I think there's somewhere
totally.
that we have to.
I totally agree. Like what you said about this, the claustrophobia, right? And the adding of language. We have this tendency not only with language, but with so many things, that if we just add this one more thing, if I just have a little bit more food on my plate, I'll just enjoy and really enjoy it. And that's first of all, you get the notion of surplus enjoyment there. Like the meal's not over when I'm full, the meal's over when I hate myself. But we always, I mean, I see it in my own life. I keep thinking, oh, if I just do an addition, then it will be solved. But a lot of the times, actually, a subtraction is the solution. If we just remove something, if we start fasting has helped me a lot. If we start meditating, if we just keep it simpler, like simplicity is for Hegel, this word keeps coming up, right? So yeah, the whole of Hegel's philosophy is subtraction, subtraction, subtraction. The thing is that we hate this. We hate when it's being done to us, because the subtraction means that we're losing an enjoyment, and the enjoyment is something that we identify with. It's the very glue of our identification. So that's why you can be stuck at one page of Hegel for like 2 hours and be like, okay, but what the fuck is happening here? Like, you don't want to lose something. You don't want to lose something. I think that's always interesting with Hegel, is that, yes, you can say he's the absolute madman. He's writing some fucking, he's a fucking charlatan. He doesn't know what he's talking about. It's just some gobbledygook. But then again, it's interesting if you actually think that, then it's even more interesting to look at it and be like, okay, but how the fuck did he think of this? Like how, because he's definitely not psychotic. He has a whole fucking system. He can be neurotic in a sense, but within that neurosis of Hegel, if you want to say that he's a bad philosopher or something like this, still to ask the question, how could he have thought of this? How could he have thought with this self-othering of concepts that continuously become something other to itself than what it is? And he does have the addition, like if you look at the science of logic, you do get new categories coming up with the explication of logic. You do get new language. So whether he's right or like naively wrong, I think to like try to think, why did he think like that, and to try to stay with it. There is a moment where it clicks and you're like, oh yeah, of course. Of course it self-others in this particular way. But it's a practice, and practice really makes you better at it. Like Hegel says it himself, it's fucking hard. You have to stay with it for a long time, then it will become easier with practice.
Wouldn't you say that's maybe like an illusion, like that you sort of, that you comprehend it or something like that, like, because you have to overcome that. Sort of this continual traversing of the illusion. Like, we have to have the illusion, like you said, that's the enjoyment part. It's necessary. It's like it's inherently necessary for the,
I think it's
for our being.
It's definitely imaginary. It's an imaginary symmetrical identification. Oh, now it clicks, of course. You see, but that's
you have to overcome it. You have to.
Lacan had a word for this. He called it misconnaissance. When you think you recognize something, but actually you're not recognizing jack shit. And I mean that's what symmetry breaking is about. That's Hegel. It's symmetry breaking all the time. And I just want to say this because our conversation kind of touched this before, that like, yes, you can use religion, Eastern religion, mystical religion as a means to go to this point. Why Hegel is so fucking radical is because he actually fucking tried to do this in a logical manner, do this sentence for sentence, word for word, to train you with this in a logical way, with thinking, not just with the body and with the senses and perception. I think that's what speculative philosophy is about.
And that's why it's Zen, like as per the description earlier, because this is tantric, it's never ending, and it's always like until you're going to come up with some authentic response to the question, because otherwise you're just parroting back, you're just agreeing with some agreement, you're just sort of falling for the illusion, right? Maybe somebody else's illusion.
I think there's nothing more meaningless and abstract than to say I agree with Hegel. That doesn't mean anything.
Sure.
Because Hegel disagrees with Hegel all the time.
Right. Yeah, no, I feel like that's the key to it. It's probably, is you're always overcoming it's inexhaustible.
Yeah.
As soon as you come up with and that's the point of science, is to sort of like to disprove the prior notions. And you're all, you're never going to get to the end. And that would be, knowing it, that you're,
Yeah.
would I guess I don't know, I got to read the end of the book.
Yeah, I think that, Zizek has this notion of the transcendental circle, and that we never get out of our own self-positing, the master signifier. Even metaphysical maths theory is getting at this right now. They're talking about the idempotence, and that, if you don't, basically maths theory is trying to say that if you don't have a self-referential master signifier, then you cannot have a chain of signifiers that are coherent. Of course, it's funny that Lacan already said this in like the 70s. But yeah, like Zizek talks about the transcendental circle, and I think, Barth put this in a beautiful way. He said the biggest fantasy is the fantasy that you will go through the fantasy. You will never go through the fantasy as such. You can go through fantasies, but the moment you're going through a fantasy, you will again get caught up in the fantasy. Or in other words, you will never lose, the potency of picture thought is something that you can never get rid of. And that you will always naively fall into again. Of course, it doesn't mean it's like hopeless and something. I do think that, I don't know, it helps me in my life to read Hegel and think about things like seriously and practice it, because when you read Hegel, you can like poke through a lot of nonsense, especially with philosophies. You can see, oh, this is not real philosophy. These are just some so-called bright ideas, but there's nothing actually here. These are just abstractions. That's what I think, at least. I'm of course talking with Alexander Barth, and he's like, oh yeah, I'm gonna overcome Hegel with my own bright ideas, but they're stuck in the faculty of the understanding. He's positing isolated substances. Like, that's not overcoming Hegel. I will thank you all for watching. I will stop the recording now.